Well, today we learned that 2 of Donald Trump's Georgia co-defendants will be going to trial 5 weeks from now, and the rest will go to trial at an unknown later date. With important legal action like that happening in courtrooms virtually every day now in the multiple criminal cases against Donald Trump and his accused co-conspirators. The most important evidentiary developments in the cases against Donald Trump continue to occur outside of the courtroom when Donald Trump makes the mistake of testifying in his own defense to friendly interviewers. And so we will begin tonight with the most important legal development of the day, which is Donald Trump's latest statements in an interview which can and will be used against him. No other criminal defendant in any of the Donald Trump cases is making any public comments about the evidence the way Donald Trump so recklessly did again today. We here at The Last Word are eager and have always been eager to present Donald Trump's defense against the charges he is facing, wherever that defense is presented, whether it be in pleadings in court or in a Trump interview. Today, for the first time ever in a Trump interview, Donald Trump seems to have been coached enough by his criminal defense lawyers to actually say, quote, "I'm not going to answer that question." That should be Donald Trump's answer to every question about any of the criminal prosecutions he is facing. But Donald Trump is by far the most reckless criminal defendant among his 21 criminal co-defendants in 2 different cases. Today, Donald Trump gave some answers in an interview about Special Prosecutor Jack Smith's case against Donald Trump in federal court in Florida on espionage and obstruction of justice charges. We want to closely analyze each of these important defense statements made by Donald Trump today. And so we are joined now by our panel of legal experts who will listen carefully to what Donald Trump has to say in his own defense. Joining us now is Andrew Weissmann, former FBI general counsel and former chief of the criminal division in the Eastern District of New York. Bradley Moss is with us. He's a national security attorney. And Neil Katyal, former acting U.S. Solicitor General. All right, let's listen to Donald Trump's answer to the question: do you believe that every CIA document that came to you as president was automatically yours to keep no matter what?
I don't think there's any dispute that I'm covered under the Presidential Records Act.
Well, you're covered, but it's not clear that it allowed you to take all those documents. You can't say
it says what it says. You're allowed. And
do you believe that every CIA document that came to you as president was automatically yours to keep no matter what?
I'm not going to answer that question.
Andrew Weissmann, finally, we landed on I'm not going to answer that question.
So I had 2 thoughts, one sort of joking and one serious. On the joking, you hardly need the firepower of a Neil Katyal or a Brad Moss to analyze this interview. I'm old enough to remember Saturday Night Live used to have in their weekly update a feature that said Generalissimo Franco is still dead. And this is that Donald Trump is still guilty and he is still confessing on TV. That's sort of the joking side. The serious side is that this case is not about the facts. He is plainly guilty. I mean, it does not take this panel to point that out. The real issue is Judge Cannon. And she has just really been slow rolling this case. She finally issued protective orders that could have been issued within a week. She has still not held a conflicts hearing with respect to 2 of the defense lawyers, so we don't even know if they're going to stay on the case. It is, thank goodness that Judge Chutkan had the wisdom to put her case before the DC, that have the DC case go before Florida, so that she's not sort of held hostage to what Judge Cannon is doing. But that's really the serious side. It's just a question of having that case go to trial. There's so much proof, and Donald Trump does not help himself each time he does one of these interviews.
All right, let's listen to more of Donald Trump's testimony today, not under oath, in his own defense.
I'm allowed to have these documents. I'm allowed to take these documents, classified or not classified. And frankly, when I have them, they become unclassified. People think you have to go through a ritual. You don't. At least in my opinion, you don't. But it's even beyond that, because the Presidential Records Act allows you to do, as president, only as president.
Bradley Boss, is the criminal jury in that trial going to hear that, in fact, you do have to go through a ritual to declassify documents?
Yes, they're going to hear about how the documents still had classification markings on them. They're going to hear about how the fact there was no declassification anywhere documented from the former president or anyone else regarding these records, and how they remain in documents containing national defense information. When you hear these interviews with him, and I feel like these interviewers almost have to issue him Miranda warnings now before he does these interviews, because he just keeps confessing. But when you hear these comments from him, it's kind of like following what Andrew was saying. It's not going to be about the facts in this case. There's not going to be a lot of dispute if this gets to trial on the facts of what occurred. This is pretrial motions and appeals or bust for Donald Trump. He has to be able to put forward this cockamamie legal theory he's got about what the Presidential Records Act lets him do, and he's going to take that all the way to the Supreme Court. That's his key to winning. If he loses those arguments and this gets to trial, there'll be motions in limine to exclude these ridiculous arguments, and he loses and gets convicted. I don't care if it's in Fort Pierce, Florida. He'll still get convicted.
Neil Katyal, did you hear any words that are usable in court as a defense?
No. I mean, basically, Trump's defense that you just heard is a defense to the crimes of which he's charged, the way that bleach is a defense to COVID, Larry Lawrence. I mean, it's just ridiculous. All I can say is I wish Trump's legal team the sincerest of luck in trying to find a provision in the Presidential Records Act that says Trump can do whatever he wants with classified documents when he leaves office. And while that team's at it, I'd love to see the provision that permits a former president to order his employees to move boxes and delete footage in order to obstruct investigators, which after all is what he is charged with. And let's all not forget that one of Trump's own employees has flipped on him once that employee got an independent lawyer as opposed to one that Trump was paying for, and is now cooperating with the prosecution and explaining all of this to them, and all this to the prosecution and to the investigators. So to me, the greatest irony in Trump's defense about the Presidential Records Act is that it was literally created to prevent a president from doing what he wants with documents. And Trump's defense is literally a contradiction in terms. It's going nowhere.
Yeah, he keeps throwing around those words, Presidential Records Act, I guess for his audience somewhere who thinks that that's somehow says what he says it says. And we all remember, of course, that Special Prosecutor Jack Smith has an audio recording, which has been made public, of Donald Trump talking about a classified document that appears, based on what he says about it, to be a U.S. military attack plan against Iran. On that audio recording, you can hear what sounds like the movement of the paper in Donald Trump's hands as he speaks, like that. And here's what Donald Trump said about that today.
What were you waving around?
I also told Bret Baier that it wasn't a classified document.
What were you waving around in that meeting? Because it certainly sounds like it was an attack.
I'm not going to talk to you about that because that's already been, I think, very substantiated, and there's no problem with it.
It hasn't been substantiated. Jack Smith says
Megyn,
it was
let me just tell you.
And you told Bret Baier.
Let me tell you. Here we go again. I'm covered by the Presidential Records Act. I'm allowed to do what I want to do. I'm allowed to have documents. The Presidential Records Act is civil, not criminal.
Andrew Weissmann, what were you waving around in your hand? I'm not going to talk to you about that.
You know, one thing you are getting from Donald Trump is a worldview. If you in addition to obviously the spin that he's engaging in and has the idea that, no press is bad press, I mean, you just really understand that he sees himself as an autocrat. This is why we fought a revolution, is to not have somebody like that who in this country. And that is very much his worldview. It is, if I say it, it's the law. This is, I am the state. And that's why this election, it's really not about politics. This is going to be an election about the country's commitment to democracy. And that, and he's telling you that. And this is nothing you have to read between the lines. It's very open that is what he is saying. That he believes that he is truly and above the law, and that's what he wants the country to vote on.